Welcome, everyone. Welcome to my basement again. If you saw me speak in the plenary, you noticed my dogs did not interrupt me during the talk. I hope they will not interrupt me now. We'll be talking together with my four fellow panelists. We'll be speaking with you as well through the Q&A function about the reallocation of space in our cities, of street space, of mobility space in particular. Before we go into that, I'm going to ask our kind colleague from POLIS, Claudia Ribeiro, to give us some tips on managing this virtual space. Claudia, please, can you run over the housekeeping rules for this session?
Yes, of course. Now this is slowing down. Hi, everyone. So my name is Claudia, working for POLIS, one of the organizers of Urbanism Next Europe. I'm not sure if everyone is already familiar with Hopin. Probably yes, after over a year of online events. But in any case, if you have any comments throughout the session, please put them in the chat box, which you will see is on the right-hand side of your screen. We were going to launch a couple of polls during the event. So whenever Philippe propels you to do it, please go ahead and click on your answer exactly in the poll function. Then in the people tab, you can see actually who is in the room in case then you want to follow up bilaterally or engage in further discussions. For specific questions, we ask you to use the Q&A function so that these don't get lost in the chat. And in case you're having problems with the visualization aspect, you can just hide the chat as you see here in the slide, or you can tap the full screen icon. Just another couple of notes. So the meeting is being recorded, and afterwards this will all be made available on a specific YouTube playlist. Yeah, and the rest of the points are mostly for our esteemed guests and speakers. In any case, after the session, we invite you to move over to the event chat. As you can see, you have the event and the session chat, and discover other sessions. Try the networking function to talk with other people and get to know people, and just go ahead and send direct messages to other participants. Can't see each other face to face, but let's try to engage. And with this, I'll leave the floor to Philippe to introduce our guests. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you also for Polis's support in helping organize this whole conference, and Claudia and Alexia's work in supporting the production of this particular session. This session, as I said, will address how cities can reconfigure and reallocate street space to fit evolving technologies, evolving choices, and evolving user behaviors. When you look out into any city street, any town street, the first thing that you probably never see, if you're not a specialist, is the amount of metal that's being stored on the curb, in the city, and in public space. This wall of steel is a defining signal of how we have made street allocation choices over the past half century or more. The basic characteristics of urban transport services and the infrastructure that we see today are dominated by these technologies that were developed and the design choices that supported the development of these technologies over 100 years ago. And we're inheriting this built environment, we're inheriting this allocation of space. And in many cases, we are realizing that it isn't fit for purpose anymore, or in many ways, there are other uses of that space that we believe may be more fit for purpose. And yet changing the allocation of space in cities, changing the allocation of space in public, in urban areas generally, is quite difficult. This is what we'll be talking about today. Different models, different ideas, different uses to which that public space can be put, understanding how we got where we are today, understanding what might be possible moving forward, understanding as well how this particular period that we've all been sharing over the past year and a half, this pandemic that we're going through, is perhaps both a catalyst and also a challenge for thinking about the ways in which we can more equitably, more joyfully in many ways, reshare the space that we all have access to in cities. With that, I'm going to ask my four panelists who have agreed to discuss this with you and with myself to go into this discussion, each by presenting a picture that they feel highlights an important element that we should consider when we think about how space has been allocated, how space might be allocated in the future, and the processes whereby that allocation is actually made real. They are, in the order in which they'll speak, Karl Reiter. Karl Reiter is project developer at the Institut für Verkehrspädagogik there, which means traffic education, for those of you who don't speak German there, and at FJ Amor. Previously, he has had a long background working on active mobility, awareness raising, sustainable transport, socialization, transport and health, emission-free logistics, cycling policy and planning, and he's also working in the European Metamorphosis Project, looking at changing the ways in which we think about public space and use public space. He'll be followed by Maria José Rojo. She is an architect and urban planner holding an international PhD in sustainable urban development by the Technical University of Madrid. She works for one of the co-organizers of this conference, the POLIS Network, where she coordinates the working group on active travel and health and is organizing work in the Reveal project. We're looking at creating a toolbox for managing urban vehicle access restrictions, UVARs, in urban areas in Europe. Following Maria José, Ruth Oldenziel will be speaking. She is professor at the History Division of the Technology Innovation Society Group at Eindhoven University of Technology. Among other things, her focus has been how technology and society are interwoven and produce the built infrastructure and sociological context for mobility. Ruth is also working on an EU transit-oriented development project, and she's, if you don't already know this series, the author of the Cycling Cities, a series of books, an excellent look at how specifically cycling and the space allocation surrounding cycling in many Dutch cities took place over the course of a half century. And finally, we'll be finishing with, in this first session, a presentation by, or a picture by Carlos Pardo. He is a Colombian psychologist with an MSc in contemporary urbanism from the London School of Economics. He focuses on urban development, mobility, including urban new mobility and technologies in mobility. And he is the founder of Despacio.org. Go see that site, an excellent resource, and is a senior advisor in NUMO, another one of the co-organizers of this conference. Carlos is an avid cyclist, as many of us are. I look forward, Carlos, to being able to cycle with you in some real setting, not in this virtual setting, and not just looking at my bikes in the background. So with that, as I said, I'm going to ask each of you, Karl, Maria José, Ruth, and Carlos, to in turn bring up a picture. Explain to us why that picture is important to us, for helping us understand this issue of reallocation of space. And then after that, we'll have some questions from the audience, but I'll also be following up with each of you with some specific questions on that. And then we'll go into a discussion organized into 3 different blocks, looking at the kind of purposes to which we would like to use and allocate public space, the ways in which that space allocation takes place, and trying to understand what have been the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic in the way in which cities are allocating space. So that's the rundown for the session. Karl, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and share your screen and turn on your microphone, and we'll be listening and watching what picture you selected and your discussion around that.
Thank you, Philippe. I think, Claudia, you will put the picture on the screen. So what you can see here is more or less the same situation. In one case, it's forbidden, and in one case, it's allowed. So if you look at our space in our cities, the space between the buildings, then we see that there is, let's say, a situation which we could judge as unfair. So if you have a family and you say, okay, I want to have my children playing out of the house, and you say there is a space there, and it's called parking space, and you take a pool like this ball pool out and say, okay, I pay the parking ticket and let my children play, then we see immediately that it's not allowed, it's forbidden. If you do the same in a car, then you have the right envelope to do that. And of course, you can do that because it's allowed. it's the place which is allocated for machines. So we see immediately this is a matter of unequal treatment or discrimination. So this one who owns a certain product gets, in addition, a certain space in our public space if he is the owner of a machine. The other ones are discriminated. They don't have, they are not allowed to use the public space in the same way. And in that way, we see that the right which we have now in our road codes or in our building laws already makes privileges for owners of machines. And this is something we should question, because 100 or 1,000 years ago, the room between the houses was a multifunctional room for communication, discourse, conflict management, and for people to meet each other, and also for children to play out and to grow up there. And now it's a very technical space, and we give a lot of privilege to machines. And we even designed our laws, our building laws, our transport laws, road codes, and so on, in that way that machines can move efficiently, and the humans are, let's say, are on the second ones in this row. And if we look on our entire street network, we see, for instance, in my home city, Graz, we have 80% of the road network, it's minor roads. And we could look road section by road section, what can we take out from the transport system completely and make it for a place to stay, a place to play, and not no transport function anymore. Or we can take out other roads and say, let's make living streets there where children are allowed to play on the streets. Or the next section could be shared space areas with a maximum speed of 20 kilometers per hour for cars, and so on. And then we could see that we can reduce privilege of the car use. This would be my statement. And I think it's also in something which is on the European agenda, equal rights, and to support all the national bodies who set up the laws or who make improvements of their road codes to have this into their on their agenda.
Thanks, Karl. Let's keep that picture up for right now, because I want to ask you, or actually discuss this very quickly with you. I think you've bundled a lot of things into that, and they're all very important. And I'm sure that some of the other speakers might pick this up as well. Fairness is one thing. What is forbidden, what is allowed, that's another element. The rights that we give to property owners, machine owners in this case. Also, the functionality of that space. Playing space is, of course, seen as less valuable than movement space. And that's pretty consistent across the whole of the network. So there are a lot of things there, and those things didn't happen all of a sudden. There are a lot of mechanisms behind how that happened. And we'll get into that into the second block. But Karl, what I want to ask you specifically is, we talk about space allocation a lot, as if there is a conscious decision to make to split the use of space among different uses. It seems that what you're describing is more along the lines of space appropriation, the appropriation of space by those who have, in this case, motor vehicles. And that's a slightly different thing. That's a much more positive, it's not an accident, it's something that happens by design. So in your view, did we end up in this situation where what is allowed and what is forbidden has been the result of an appropriation of space, or a decision to allocate amongst different uses?
Do you mean that how this could happen, that we ended up with that?
How is it that this situation where the one that's in the picture, where you have the same thing, two young children playing with balls, one outside of a vehicle, one inside of a vehicle. One is a forbidden activity, is not allowed, or at least is certainly looked down upon, and the other one is allowed because it's taking place in a car. Based on what you were saying, could you go a little bit more into how that actually happened? How is it that that right to use that space was given to the vehicle and not to the children? There's a bit of an echo as well. I don't know if some of you hear that, but I certainly hear it. I'm going to turn off my speaker as soon as I stop talking.
Yeah. I think how it happened, that's clear. This was, let's say, with the growth of the motorization and of course of a well-oiled lobbying machine of the vehicle industry and the oil industry, and they made a lot of awareness for the legal bodies, but also for these people who did the journalists and so on. Yeah. And this was the way, but now we have to find back. Of course, we need also lobby work for that, and I think we need to discuss. It's maybe a little bit like in the agriculture where we had this multicultural use of the soil, and now we have the monoculture, and we see the same idea on the streets. And we have to come back to this more fair distribution of space. But I think it's also European activity because it's about unequal distribution, or we have a discrimination topic, I would say. Because the road codes, they are national things, or the building laws even regional things. But I think it needs a European push to change it. I hope I got your question.
Certainly at the national level, at the EU level, there have been efforts to place a system that ends up in the situation that you're illustrating there. We'll come back to this issue because that'll be the second topic of discussion when we finish this round. I'm sorry, I'm still hearing the background. I hope it's not on my side. Background noise. Maria José, I'm going to ask you to likewise show the photo that you feel illustrates something important for us to understand around this allocation or appropriation of space in cities. And then I'll follow up with a few questions for you as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. So, well, yes, some commonalities also with Karl's image. I wanted to highlight, that public space is a scarce and very valuable asset in cities, and that due to the decades of car-centric design, currently public space in cities is overwhelmingly allocated in favor of the private car. But that cities actually play a key role in reversing this situation, as they have the competence to reallocate space away from cars and in favor of active travel, but also livability in general. And well, in the last year, we have seen it all over the world, how many cities have been reallocating space towards active travel. And this has demonstrated that cities can be agile in times of need, and that space reallocation interventions do not necessarily imply long administrative processes, expensive interventions, or complex design. So we have seen many different types of interventions, from pop-up bike lanes, extension of footpaths, open streets, slow streets, combinations of some of them. So the common denominator is to give space back to people. And I think, well, this image illustrates some of the aspects of this process. It's an image from the program called Protegim las Escolas, We Protect Schools in Barcelona. It's Escola Estatal, and it's one of the 25 interventions that were done around schools during 2020, but actually it's part of a much more ambitious project to intervene the space around 120 schools in the whole city. So this is part of what I find interesting, that it's kind of small interventions which have a systemic approach at city level. So by reallocating space in the surroundings of schools throughout the city, we have actually an impact, a positive impact at the urban level. So this program fixes these kind of actions in the surroundings of schools as a priority, to reduce accidents, to improve air quality, to reduce environmental noise, to generate more space for meeting in the surroundings as well, and to increase the visualization of school surroundings. And it also entails the involvement of the educational and the neighborhood communities in the definition of this project through several, through an impulse group, a table for each school environment, a monitoring group, and several other activities. And additionally, also these interventions are designed to be permanent as well. So this is something I'd like to highlight. During this year at POLIS, we have been doing several meetings on the topic of space reallocation, trying also to understand the challenges that cities were facing when implementing these kind of measures, from pop-up bike lanes to school streets to improving walkability and others, and to try to help them also exchange experiences and learn from each other. And I'd also like to mention the REVEAL project, which stands for Regulating Vehicle Access for Improved Livability. And this project develops tools to support a systematic and coordinated way to develop best practice UVARs, urban vehicle access regulations. I think these tools are really useful and needed as well if we really want to reallocate space for livability and for active travel. Just very briefly mention that this project looks at different kinds of UVARs, from zero emission zones to spatial interventions, pricing measures such as congestion pricing, for example. So different spatial interventions like cycling streets, traffic filters, etc. This would be, for example, this would be an example of a spatial intervention, so removing parking and road space. And also, it not only looks at different types of UVARs, it also looks at the process from the design of the UVAR through its implementation, its operation. So it looks at the whole cycle from different angles that are and different aspects that are important for this transition or this process. For example, user needs and acceptance, governance and financing, system design, and also mobility options that accompany these kind of measures to make them successful. Yes. I leave it here and I give the floor to my colleagues.
Thanks, Maria Jose. I'd like to come back on this specific intervention, then ask you a general question based on the work that you're doing in REVEAL. The specific question is, can you tell us what that space was used for before?
Well, this space before was partly, it was road space, it was a lane. So actually it's a crossing, as we can see. I chose it also because it's a crossing which, as we know, is particular sensitive points of the network. So what it did, it tightened the road space in the crossing and gave more space to, as we see, mainly it's for playing and for interacting. But actually, previously it was road space.
Yeah, and in that, of course, by taking a space and giving it for play, or just for sitting in this case, the geometric redesign of the intersection meant that traffic speeds had to be slower in order for them to. So you have two things going on here. You have the reallocation of space, and then you have that reallocation of space being used to actually make all of the space safer by slowing down the vehicles. I think that's quite interesting.
Yes, exactly. All these measures came hand in hand with reducing speed limits in the surroundings of areas. So it's actually a combination of a wider strategy to make the environments around schools safer, in addition to make them healthier.
So the question I have, the follow-up question that's more general based on the work that you've done in REVEAL and other work that you've done at POLIS. Here, we're talking about the changing the function of the space. It's no longer mobility space, it's social space. So you've taken mobility space and made it into social space. There are also areas or interventions where you reallocate the use of space but keep the same function. And that would be typically where you give space for cycling or for scootering or for walking. It's still a mobility function, but you're reallocating among different uses. Is that something that in your work in Reveal comes up? And are there differences in the ways in which that works when you're talking about switching the function of a space versus reallocating the use of a space among different users? Is that something that has an impact on the acceptability of the project or the efficacy of the project? Is that something that you've come across in the Reveal project?
We know that we couldn't only restrict these kind of interventions only to other mobility options, only to cycling and walking. Of course, these are important, but I think especially during the pandemic, we've seen that we also need more space actually for enjoying, for playing in this case. So this is, in terms of accessibility, I think it's quite easy because it's quite, they're quite popular among, and it's quite visible how these places are used. So I think there can be different purposes and different uses that all that road space, which actually we have now and which is allocated to the private motorized vehicles, I think it can actually not only change from one mode to another, but actually it can also, depending on the circumstances, on the specific cases, for example, in the surroundings of schools, I think it's especially, it makes sense, but yes, so I think it can be wider. And indeed, in the Reveal project, we are also considering these changes in use.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to turn to Ruth. Ruth, one of the things I like about your work is that you're, of course, a historian of technology, but you look at much more than just technology. You look at a number of ways in which it interacts with societies, but you're also a bit of a micro historian. You draw out from what happens in these changes and these transitions, some of these very small things that matter. And so I'll be coming back to you over our discussion in this session on that. But for right now, Ruth, if you could share your photo and describe how you view this, what this means in terms of the use of space. And I think you're muted right now. Oh, and you can't unmute yourself. I'm going to ask Claudia, can we hard unmute Ruth?
No, I do not have permission for that. I would suggest, Ruth, if you could just refresh your page and perhaps we move with Carlos for now. And
So
I think that would work.
If you refresh your screen, Ruth, and let's see if that works. Otherwise, you can leave and come back into the session. And I'm going to go over to Carlos. Carlos, there you are.
I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you fine. So you have done a lot of work with NUMO around thinking about ways in which we can allocate space or understand how space should be used, or at least measure how space is used. And what are the guidelines that we should use in thinking about the allocation of space in the future? I like that you've created a fairly open framework that allows us to deal with a lot of new modes that have yet to come onto our streets and thinking about that. So can you describe in this image what it is from your perspective that's important for us to understand in terms of the allocation of space? And Ruth, just one last thing, I would suggest that you leave the session and then come back in, and that hopefully will fix the problem. All right.
I'm fine.
Oh, you're fine. Okay, super. Okay, Carlos, go ahead and we'll come back to Ruth. Super.
Yep, thanks for this chance to talk about this. And actually, I'm going to put a link on the chat so that anybody who wants can actually play with the platform that I used to prepare this image. Basically, the message that we're trying to give from NUMO and that I've been obsessed basically with is that streets are being redesigned as we speak, but we need to really start thinking about everything else that will come. If you look at this image, and I prepared it for this purpose, is let's understand how streets could become in the future. And in that sense, how should we allocate the space for each of the modes and what are the criteria with which we should give them the space. So for example, you see there's already a scooter, there's a bicycle, there's a, what did we call it, TNC, so it's a ride hail, there's an autonomous vehicle, and there's a magic carpet. Each of these has a reason for being there. And if you would ask me, this would be a typical layout of a street in the future. But if you look at any traffic code or design manual, you don't really see very good guidance on any of these modes. Even sidewalks in many cases don't have any good guidance. So we are proposing to everybody, start thinking about all these things, not just because it's fun to think about them, but rather because there is a way to, and there is a need to determine what are the dimensions that you need to give them, where in the street layout should you give them access, which should you ban or which should you not allow in certain cases. So that's sort of all the discussion that we have around there. And as part of that, we've created another, like Street Mix is a platform that we have supported in the past, that we have started to use in the past, and we help them increase their functionality. But it exists in 2013. And they are an open source platform that we love working with, because you can just do your own thing. You can create other functionalities from your side if you know how to code, and it remains open source. But then we also have other platforms and tools that we started working with, so that we can help determine how to define whether a street, whether a vehicle will have or will not have be allowed in a street. So I'm going to paste another link, which is not a public link, but just because people are here, I want you to play around with this other platform, because you can then start playing with the characteristics of a vehicle that may or may not exist, that you may have designed, but you don't know whether it would be allowed in streets. And it actually gives you very detailed guidance now of how to allocate space, require data from them, and then sort of start to really become much more detailed in the way that we allocate space, price the use of the street, request data, and many other things that are really not very logical at this point. And I think that is something that is important. And the last thing that I wanted to share is, well, when we started working with Street Mix, actually, I told them, we are going to fund you so that we can have an autonomous vehicle and a magic carpet in the platform. So before, they didn't have any magic carpets, and we said, well, we will give you the time and the resources so that you can include the magic carpet. And it was a relatively long discussion to convince them. But it's basically because we need to have a way to imagine that some other thing will come and we don't really know what it is about. And we have actually used this, for example, in the case of Bogota, where I'm sitting now, where we helped in redesigning a street with the help of more than 6,000 citizens. And many of them actually put a magic carpet in their proposed redesign. Because of course it's sort of saying, well, something will happen in the future and we don't know what it is. So the last link I'm going to share, and with that I'm going to close, is my explanation of why we need to think about magic carpets in the streets. And I hope that it enlightens everybody. So thanks for the time.
It makes me think of that floating skateboard in Back to the Future, which also, as I know, is something that your tool can handle because it's fully parametric. Carlos, I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Maria Jose, because here we're talking about different ways of allocating this space between the buildings to mainly mobility uses. So to getting around, okay, the sidewalk is not just mobility use, and you have some sitting and some green space. But I wonder how you would address and how you might be thinking already about non-mobility uses of space, and finding a way, a tool, if you will, that helps understand what are the trade-offs that can take place if you were, for example, to take out that space completely and put in place a big ball pen like the one that Karl showed, or some sitting space only, but no movement space, like what Maria José showed, in play space. So is that completely a different process? Or is there a way of bringing, in your mind, maybe in some point in the future, bring those decisions into the same kind of mechanism and tool for at least helping make those decisions, changing the function of space entirely?
So that is a wonderful question. And of course, the rules that you gave us was just show one image. But if you go to the website of StreetMix, you can actually put in a food truck, for example. And so that is sort of starting to answer the question. Of course, urban space has different ways of being used, and we must define how is it that we can determine whether this can have a food truck or not, right? The main assumption that we've had for 100 years, literally 100 years, is if it's a car, it should go, nobody should ask any questions, just allow it. But thankfully, in the past few years, and especially from the pandemic, people have said, well, no, wait, like if nobody's using it, why not use it for something else, like a restaurant, or for people to just walk around and whatever, and for other reasons. But that has been a very useful way to start to understand this. In the discussions around the periodic table, which is the second tool that I mentioned, we have been having a very long discussion around this, because basically what we are doing is we have literally a formula that tells you, depending on each of the criteria, whether you should allow or not, and whether you should charge a very high or a low or a medium price for the use. And again, in Bogota, we are about to convince them to start using the formula so that they can determine, for example, like a very, very complicated example. An informal vendor who is very low income and is the person who is a vulnerable part of a vulnerable population and wants to sell something in a parking space. Do you allow them? Do you charge them? Do you require data from them? And we are able to answer that right now. We are able to say, well, yes, because of all these criteria, for example, that person would actually be subsidized for the use of that parking space. But if somebody comes in a Tesla what is the name of the horrible thing? Cybertruck, they will not only have to charge, they will have to pay 5 times more. And they will have to provide all the data of everything that they're doing. Plus, you will not allow them in many places. So that is sort of an extremely technocratic way of trying to answer the question. But I think that once we have the technocratic answer, we can start understanding sort of the more social side of things, because engineering has been extremely technocratic in their answers. And we need to say, well, yeah, we can also be technocratic. Like, look, this is my entire algorithm, which is in a website, and you can go there and you can actually print the entire set of recommendations and giving links to all the indications. But I know it's a little bit crazy for now, but I'm sure that many people will be able to use it in the future and start playing around more seriously with it. And yeah, so I think my time is up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and give this space to Ruth.
What I'll just follow up with a quick statement, because we're going to come back to this. But what I like about that approach, of course, you know, the French side of me loves the technocratic approach. But what I like about that is that it also surfaces some of these technical decisions that are often hidden. And by making them more aware or more visible, then you can start thinking about, well, do we want to make this decision? And is this the right way to make that decision? A lot of decisions right now, we don't know how that operate, because they are in the back offices under planning rules and under different formulas that are never exposed. So that's really interesting to hear. So Ruth, sorry about jumping over you. I'm glad we can come back to you for the end of this. I'm looking forward to your picture. I saw it already, so it made me hungry. And it also made me want to go wherever that is. So take us to your big table.
Actually, I'm very glad I went last, because it allows me to tie some of the themes. So what we're looking at here is, I'm actually in the picture with my neighbors here. This is a street, an ordinary Dutch street that in a way, I think many of you in other countries would consider a very well-designed street, because what we see on the left corner, you see a bike lane, and then in the middle, just a residential street, and you see bike racks. Well, and then of course the table. what we did here is we wanted to get rid of the parking spaces and reallocate that. And what you see on the left are planters that are exactly the size of car spaces to highlight what you could do with those spaces. This was actually illegal. We then asked all the neighbors to come and join and bring food. And neighbors who were living across from each other had never really talked to each other, and so it became a social space. What I've learned through this experiment and also through my historical readings is that I think the key to unlock the space and the reallocation of space, that is the subject of our panel, is to go deep into parking. Parking is the key to everything, and to question it. So I'm so happy that Karl showed us that that very evocative image, because the car is obviously parked and therefore it's allowed. What we discovered is that it started actually to park bicycles in the car space. And that was not allowed. And we're talking here in the city of Amsterdam, the capital city of cycling in the world. It is not allowed. So it's not machines versus children, it's four wheels versus the rest of us. So that is really one discovery that we made. And this is from a left-wing green city government that does not allow us. And the green that you saw had to be basically on wheels. It had to be mobile. But what is so interesting about cars is, and we noticed from studies, they stand still for 90% of the time. So they're actually not mobile, they're immobile, but they occupy that space. But for bicycles to be mobile and to be parked in the space is not allowed. So we are getting back to the car-governed city that we have talked about so much. And I was really struck by Carlos's image, because yes, he describes the future, but what is not in that picture is what do we do with parking? And I can tell you that the future that you are describing, Carlos, is in a way is already in the Netherlands, and still we have a lock-in into parking. So my design principle would be private parking has to be private. That's a private solution, and the rest is public. And I think that will free up a lot of space. And I would make the exception for bicycles. Bicycles need to be in the place, not on the sidewalk, as was the case here in this street, but should be in the places where we have now cars, and we will free up. So that is one design principle for the future that really needs to be incorporated. And the second one is right now, transit-oriented development that is celebrated as very sustainable. Yes, it is sustainable, but it's based on public transit, and it's based on pedestrians as shoppers, or in this marriage of public transit with real estate, or it is pedestrians as public transit customers. But again, cycling is not part of that. So I'm not saying that cycling is the answer to everything, but through the prism of cycling, you discover a lot of issues, because cycling is between cars and walking. It has two wheels. So you could say it's walking on two wheels in the legal sense, because it's not a car. And cycling is also institutionally, if you look over 100 years, is the car industry and lobby has made the regulation that we see parking as a right for people with cars. And public transit is another lobby that has been very strong, and both of them have embraced pedestrians, but not cycling. So the second intervention that I want to highlight here is that as part of this intervention, the picture that I'm showing, what we also did, we started to do what we called parking place, where people who did not have a car asked for a permit for 20 euros a month, that's the rate for parking, and do whatever they want to do with that space. And it turned out non-car users are not allowed to get a parking space. Now, so I think both of these interventions shows that parking is really what it's all about. I leave it at this for the moment.
It's clear, in the opening, when I said one of the things that most people don't ever see that's in front of their face in any city is the wall of steel on both sides of the street. It just simply doesn't register anymore. That space, let's call it for what it is. It's not parking, really. It's storing private property in public space. But it's only a special type of private property, as you point out, Ruth, because if I wanted to put my refrigerator out there, if I wanted to put a couch out there, if I wanted to put the toy pool that Karl had, then that would not be allowed, because that's not viewed as legal use of space, and it's not viewed as efficient or effective use of space, because somewhere behind the allocation of parking space to motor vehicles, or that space to parking motor vehicles, is because they are considered to provide added value to the city. They contribute to economic activity. They contribute to economic prosperity. But I wonder what your views are, rather, on how that happened. That'll be the second block we're going to talk about. Ruth, I just want to get back to you on, so both on what Carlos said and what you said together. I take it that this question of how do we allocate that space to different uses, including moving away from parking, is important. You focused a lot on the bicycle. Carlos mentioned that there's a lot of form factors, a lot of things that are coming on that we see in different cities, less in Dutch cities, but in other cities as well, including e-scooters, push scooters. Dutch cities, of course, have the older version of the mobilet type moped scooters, also sharing some of the space until just recently when they were pushed out. So how do you see, even among those lighter users, not the heavy cars for users, the allocation of space, and what kind of ideas are you getting from the Netherlands on how to deal with that arrival and that mix of, let's call it, relatively limited use of space that's allocated to those vehicles?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, the legal frame in all countries is if you're not four wheels, then you are not a car, right? So you are not a car. And so you don't have a lot of privileges. So the issue of all the different two-wheelers that we see today, it's actually very old, because we had the mopeds and it was the same issue. But so in terms of the legal framing and the traffic engineering, they're not supposed to exist. So I think that if we understand, and that's a question perhaps, but if we understand step scooters and all these two-wheelers to be more sustainable, because they take up A, less space, B, have a less CO2 footprint, and that's a point that's not being researched, but that's anecdotally, are actually more mobile. They're more used. So there are more in motion than cars are actually. Cars are parked longer. So if we say that that's a good thing, then we should change the law and say two-wheelers have the kind of the rights that cars used to have and no longer should have. But that's a decision that we have to make if we say this is part of the mix, because the alternative is, if you say, well, that's a private mobility, if I'm honest and I say all private cars need a private solution in parking, then you could say, and that's what they're trying to say in the Netherlands, then bicycles also need a private solution, and you need to storage it in the same way. And I think that is, from the Netherlands, you know, we live in a sort of future and a paradise, I think that's the wrong conclusion, because a bicycle is not a car with two wheels. It is walking, it's more sustainable, and we want that. But that's something that we have to decide together, that's the future that we want. Because then otherwise, we have to say public transit is what we want, and maybe if we want bicycle, then it has to be public sharing bicycle programs only, and not private bicycles. And walking is obviously what we prefer most. So that is, for me, the decision that we have to make.
First, let's ask, I'm going to open up the first poll that we have today, because that's going to go back to that you just made and that Maria Jose, Carlos, and Karl picked up on. And that poll question that you'll have, if you go under the poll tab, you'll see, Claudia, I hope that you are able to put it up. Do we see the poll now?
It should be in the poll.
It should be visible to attendees right now.
Okay, so the question is, what should be the basis for allocating street space? So we touched on a few things: efficiency, multi-use. The choices here are, it should be proportional to the space that's needed. Cars need more space, so they should get more space. They need more space because they're bigger, they travel faster, and they're stored all of the equitable access. Space should be allocated so that people can have the most people can have the best access. A bit what I was saying earlier, we should allocate space to those uses that produce the greatest economic return. And that's been a bit of the thinking in the past on why we've allocated so much space for motor vehicles. To the least environmental harm, this is going to a bit of what Ruth, you were just saying, to the safest use of that space, or to the use of the space that makes it safest for all other users beyond those that are operating a vehicle, or to the greatest versatility, the use of space that can be multi-purposed. These are just, we don't have an other option here. But so I'll let people answer that while I'll turn to the panel and ask you about that specific question. From your perspective, what should be the basis for allocating street space? It's often, Ruth, you talk about this a lot in your works. It's contested space. There are a lot of ways in which that space can be used. Karl, from your perspective, among those options or other options, what should be the fundamental basis for allocating space? Or, because it may be different in different contexts, what should be the fundamental basis for allocating space in a given context, and describe what that context is?
I can directly connect to Ruth. I think that we should forbid on-street car parking because this is inefficient space use. Of course, we cannot do it from today to tomorrow, but step by step, we should get rid of this privilege system. It's an inefficient space use, and I would even go further, and not saying it's a private thing. Because if every private house has an underground garage, then you need the street for these cars to go to this garage. So it's much better to have collective garages and no need to go to every house, let's say by car, and then you immediately get also a lot more of the street space for moving cars. And this would be starting with parking, but parking concentrated in some areas. And we can let's say to car drivers, it's also allowed for them to walk 200 meters or 300 or 400 meters, even if this seems to be, let's say, unthinkable, or it's not very common to think. Everybody thinks he can park his car as near as possible to the place where he wants to go. But we should leave this idea away. Yeah.
I'm reminded of some of the work that was done in the city of Montreal, in which when they were taking away car parking for some gas works, and then they put in place a bicycle lane afterwards. They actually did an inventory of available parking space near that intervention, and it turns out that there was a lot of unused parking availability near that. So that 100, it wasn't even 200 meters, it was more like 100 meters to get it. Ruth, you had something to say? And then I'm going to turn to Maria.
Because I think you asked, what's most important. I think the myth that the car industry and lobby has sold us on, that cars are represent economic growth. I can explain it historically, but that is today for private cars, that's really a myth. And the parking represents that because it's subsidized. Because Karl, the example that you give to say, well, let everybody park their car in their own home. Well, if you were to put a price tag on that, let's say that's 100,000 euros just to build that, right? That's what it represents. But currently what cities do is they basically subsidize public space for only like 100 euros a year. And I think we need to really rethink that that public space is not only there's not enough of it, but parking is it costs like 100,000 of public money that just sits there and is not economically sustainable. So I think that in terms of Carlos, what all kinds of algorithms and technocratic answers that you are formulating, I think is tactically what we need to do. We need to really unpack. And again, I'm so focused on parking because I've discovered that it's really not the mobility, but it's the parking, the sitting still. And that is really the point of pressure and the point of most resistance of the regime, the car regime.
I'm going to just step in very quickly in Carlos's defense. He is not a technocrat. I know him, even though he is speaking the language. Carlos, I'm going to go first to Maria José, and then Carlos, and then Ruth. I want to come back to this issue of the space that's taken up by parking. So, Maria José, what, from your perspective and from the perspective of the work that you've done, should be the basis for allocating street space in which context?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I agree with the previous interventions, and I think that the change in the mindset will, of course, take a lot of work because it has been decades of the whole cities being designed around cars. I think that this is the reason why urban vehicle access regulations sometimes have that much resistance, and it creates these kind of problems. So that's why in the case of the Reveal project, it looks at this process on how from which elements are important to be looked at in order to make the regulations and restrictions to vehicle access a success. And one of them, one of the angles of this is the mobility options. So the mobility alternatives that need to come when we are speaking about removing parking, removing in car lanes, etc. So I would just like to highlight that it's important also to bring these kinds of measures with other mobility options that, of course, entail, for example, bike lanes, etc., bike parking, as it has been mentioned, and these kind of relocation measures. So I don't have one answer, just like to highlight that point of bringing also alternatives. I think this improves also public acceptance.
As you can hear in the background, my dogs are agreeing with you 100%. So I'm going to turn over to Carlos. Carlos, can you pick up this? And hopefully they will settle down.
Yeah. I think we're getting to somewhere really interesting sort of to really craft this answer. So I think, as we've also said, and Ruth was saying something very interesting, it is a tactical thing to be a technocrat because because I'm a psychologist, I'm not an engineer. I've been working with engineers for a long time who always say, oh, but wait, but you're a psychologist. So then I've said, okay, so let's do the whole thing of what you're doing. let's check your OD surveys, let's check your sampling, let's check everything that you're doing, and now tell me how you are being so mathematical about everything. It turns out most of the things that they do are just because they just make a decision because they just feel like it. And that's why sort of in the work of the periodic table, we said, okay, let's do something. Let's define, let's look at every policy that we can find and see how they are determining the allocation of space. And what we ended up defining was, let's say that weight, speed, space, emissions, and associated health benefits would be the 5 criteria that we need to work on in order to determine how and where a vehicle can move. And that's in part because they do relate directly to an issue that we need to look at, like equity, safety, environment, but also because they were criteria that could be directly measured by generally anybody. So that makes it easier to understand. So that is sort of where we came and where we arrived at to say, let's do a complete formula that can say exactly what happens with somebody or with a vehicle that is coming. And then when a technocrat comes or when an engineer comes and say, oh, but where are you getting this from? And then you can show them 50 pages of how you came with this idea. And then you can complement it by saying, but I'm going to explain it easier. If it's a person, they can do whatever they want. If it goes far away from being a person or a human being, just walking, then they have to do a lot of things and you have to be very careful with them. That's basically the summary of everything that I would tell them. So it's really interesting to sort of try and explain these questions from the very mathematical point of view and then from the more social and sort of qualitative way. And both of them will arrive at the same way when you know how to do it. So yeah, and I could talk about this forever, so I'm just going to stop.
No, Carlos, I think it's really the point of speaking the right language, because the way in which we ended up with this allocation of space was through, in many cases, that'll be our second topic very quickly in the second poll, is through these technical decisions. You know, does it conform to this technical design criteria? If not, then we should make it this way. And there's never really thinking about the assumptions behind those. So surfacing both the technical decisions and the assumptions behind those, I think, are really important in terms of trying to readdress the use of space in public areas. So I'm going to ask Claudia to show the response of the poll. Yeah, just hold on one second, Ruth. Claudia, if you can show the results of the poll question. Ruth, go ahead and speak while they're showing up.
Yeah, because I think there is a question lurking around here. Yes, it is true that a lot of the decisions are technical and appear to be technical, but ultimately they are political decisions. One of the things that I discovered when I was talking to the politicians and say, why can you not change the parking place for people who do not have cars? And they just say, well, it's a rule. Well, where is the rule? Nobody knew where the rule was. And so we had a hard time to explain to them that they have the power to change the rule. That's why we chose them. You know, it's a green government. So I think that Carlos is really right to with his work to open that up box. But we should not forget that historically, that is what these technocratic rules have done. They have made invisible the politics behind it, and we have to make it political again.
Yeah.
Karl.
But that's what I wanted to say. It's much easier if there is an European directive to make the system more fair, more equal rights. And then it's easier for the local governments, for the national governments to adapt. Otherwise, it's the bottom-up work, very, very hard work, as you as you told. Yeah.
I think I was hoping to discuss the return of the polls. I don't seem to see the poll returns in my window. Claudia, do you?
So you can't show them
that?
directly on the screen, but if you go to the tab, you should be able to see them.
Yeah, I see the poll questions, but I don't see the poll. Nope.
Straight to the bottom, it says show results.
Show results. I'm doing that, and nope. But this isn't the first time Hopin is giving me some problems. I'm going to do something really quickly. I'm going to show something. Carlos, I'm going to ask that you comment the poll returns and give the numbers. Can you do that?
Yeah. So
all right. So let me just show one thing real fast before you situate yourself. And what I'm going to show is this discussion that we're having around the idea of space allocation. And what I'd like to show is just the result of a quick calculation. This is my one graphic for the talk. This calculation that we did on the both static and dynamic use of space for different means of transport. And what we did is we took, the space that's consumed by a vehicle or a person while it's moving. It's kind of hard because there are a lot of formulas to take into account. And then, of course, the space that's used when the vehicle is stopped, and measured this in terms of square meters per hour of use, which is mixing both the dynamic element and the static element. And Ruth, what you can see is it's all parking. I mean, first off, the dynamic movement is double, let's take from cycling to, or triple rather, from cycling to a car, but it's really the parking. And that square, that black square, grows as the duration of the parking goes. So this is for a 6-kilometer round trip, 2 hours of parking. If that were a workday, that square would take up the whole screen. And that is really the consumption of space that we're talking about. That is something that we feel we don't ever really see in a metric, and certainly decision makers don't see that. So I just wanted to reinforce that point that Ruth and some of the others were making about parking being the real kind of space, the activity that consumes most of the space. So I'll stop sharing that. That was my little shared screen. Carlos, what can you tell us about the poll returns that I can't see?
Yeah, I'm going to actually share an image of the results so everybody can see them in case it's difficult. So yeah, we can see that we are preaching to the choir, I guess, would be my overarching conclusion. People do see that access is the main criteria and the proportion to the space needed. I would like to hear who gave that vote to understand sort of where. I mean, so just one very small thing on that. Like, the one difficult thing to define is whether, for example, a bus is very large, is particularly polluting in some cases. Should it be given the same rights as the Tesla Cybertruck? And so the way that we solved it in the periodic table was we divide by the maximum capacity of the vehicle, and then it's fine. But I'll let you comment because now you can see it.
No, I think you said it perfectly. I think that it's interesting because we often talk about what's a fair allocation of space, and in fact, I think there was some work done by Marco Tel Bromerstadt and colleagues at the University of Amsterdam on what is the fair allocation of space. And maybe that isn't the best way to think about space allocation. I think equitable access, I can live with that. I think that is it's interesting that no one said the greatest economic returns. So there clearly no boomer economists or transport planners amongst us here today. But what I also think is interesting is that safety, environmental harm, and versatility are also up on the scoreboard. Versatility is something that I think is emerged, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw that not only could this space be repurposed, but it could be repurposed quite rapidly and lightly, tactically. So that's interesting. So let's move on to the next topic. We don't have too much time, but we have touched on some of these issues already. Carlos, if you can stop sharing your screen. Thank you for that. I might ask you to do that for the next round. But this next topic is around how did we end up where we are today? And it's more about the processes that led to this allocation of space. We touched on a few of them, but I guess my big question for you is, in your view, and this will be from projects you've worked on or your experience in the cities that you live in, how did we get to the allocation of space? We talked about this technocratic process. We talked about vision-led processes a bit, although they haven't been very apparent since the 20s and 30s, at least for car-based transport. And we talked about democratic processes. So I guess I'll start with Ruth, and then I'll go to Maria José, Carlos, and then Karl. So Ruth, you touched on this a bit. In the Netherlands, we know there's been a lot of change over the past 50 years, but there was a system in place before that, and there's a system in place now. Can you talk a bit about how the allocation of space was actually implemented, how it was activated, and by whom, and what process? Was it by accident? Was it by design? Was it by a mix of everything?
Well, actually, the Netherlands is very instructive because, like many other countries in the 1920s and 30s, engineers prepared and politicians prepared for a car truck future. Even though in the Netherlands there were very few cars, less so than elsewhere, but we see that the highways are already built for the cars that are not there. And what happens then as a traffic principle is that we get the separation of space, and in the Netherlands something peculiar then happens. We get a it's maybe too extended, but we get an infrastructure countrywide that separates out cyclists from cars. And I know that people abroad see this as, well, this progress. But I think we are, the Netherlands has a kind of a lock-in because it's still based on flow and speed as a principle. So that is the principles of flow is really what, and congestion, and that's the only thing that's the right and based on cars that got us there. Mm-hmm. So the notion of speed. And I think COVID, we'll talk about in the third round, but we came to a standstill in a way in terms of mobility, and we had to rethink what speed and mobility really is. But the late 19th century, early 20th century is really about also a car, I should mention, that was a fossil fueled car and not an electric car. There were electric cars around 1900, but they didn't make it because they never were based on speed, but they were for local use. So the notion of speed and racing came out of leisure, high class, and it had nothing to do with transport, was what got us there. And all the principles really flow from that. It was a big struggle. It never came about just like that. We see a lot of resistance in the 50s. We see a lot of resistance in the 70s. And we're still trying to undo it. I can go into more details, but I think this is sort of what you were asking, right?
Yeah, I think, yes, exactly. And I think I'm going to break up the flow of this question very quickly, because there's an interesting question, or there's actually three questions now from the audience, but I'd like to bring this one in as we're talking about how these decisions were made. So equitable access, that is what we saw collectively as the main way to think about allocating space. That's not necessarily how it's been done in the past. Ruth, you were talking about how in fact it was done is based on the technical characteristics of a vehicle that was being used by a few people, but probably very powerful people, and who wanted to be able to have access using that vehicle. But cars also provide access, and motor vehicles provide access for a lot of really essential functions. Lisa in the Q&A is asking, what about those people, tradespeople, who have to have, up until now, in order to exercise their activity, need to have a fairly large vehicle, bigger than a cargo bike, in which they can keep their tools and their materials and work. So the question is not necessarily how do plumbers or electricians work in car-light cities, but rather it is how do we take into account different uses of city space by different vehicles. And so yeah. So Ruth, if you can touch on that a little bit. And then I'm going to turn to Maria José, Carlos, and Karl, and then we're going to finish up with that cycle of questioning on what is the way in which you view that we've gotten here. So what about those other uses of vehicles that are necessary in cities, and how do we make space for that?
Well, I think it is very important to say that there are people who have cars only to go on vacation abroad, and have a car in front of the house. Then there are people who really use it for commuting, and then there are enterprises that need it to deliver. But we also now know that a lot can be delivered by all kinds of alternatives. But in terms of the discourse and the powerful argument, it is always put together. But if we unpack it, then we'll see actually very few people need to go into the city by car. So I think the question is very much correct, but it's usually used the other way. It's usually said, yes, but we are speaking for all the people that need a car. But the people who use that argument usually themselves are not using the car that much. So I think we need to really unpack that coalition. It's the same as shop owners who do not live in a city and say, my customers need to come to my shop. But the shop owner usually does not live in a city, but the customers do live in the city. But the shop owner is using that argument to say that I need a parking place in front. So it's a good question to make, diverse.
Maria Jose, when we were talking about UVAR's regulations managing urban access, clearly this is something that comes up. How do you provide access to those who may not live in the city or may live in other parts of the city but need to have their vehicles to deliver services or carry out their livelihoods? Can you give some input from the work that you've done through Reveal or more generally through POLIS on how to manage those different needs?
Yes, and I'm very happy about this question also because of course, it's one of the topics we're looking at, like permits and exceptions that need to be done for different characteristics. And just yesterday, we published a guidance concretely on these ways to approach these permits and exceptions for urban vehicle access regulations. And it tackles precisely these kind of issues, no? So how different cities have, for example, allowed access for deliveries, for emergencies, also for residents, and which kind of the residents under which circumstances, which requisites are different. So different cities that have implemented different kind of UVARs have had different approaches, and there's a lot that we can learn from different experiences. And I'll put the link there. And also in June, we will have also a webinar specifically on this topic, on permits and exemptions for urban vehicle access regulations. I think it's a very important topic. And also I liked what Ruth said about undoing, and when she spoke about speed. And I'm positive in the sense, for example, lately of being how many cities are putting speed limits, Brussels, Graz, Grenoble, Helsinki, in Spain as well, Zurich. So I'm positive about all these measures in setting up, in this case, 30 km/h citywide limits, and how they are being replicated in many places. And in relation to the process on how to do this space reallocation, I mentioned before that cities, of course, play a key role as they have the capacity and the competence to reallocate space, but also highlight the role of other stakeholders, citizens, of course. And we have seen many experiences that are good examples of how to collect feedback from citizens on when they consider that space interventions are needed or space reallocations are needed. For example, Sustrans, the space to move tool. Also Rotterdam in their walking strategy collected also input from citizens in the pedestrian in the pedestal. So we see many examples of how to integrate as well the input and the feedback from citizens. Sometimes we see in the UVAR project that other administrative levels need also to collaborate. For example, when legal frameworks need to be modified, etc. So sometimes local administrations also need to collaborate with other levels. Of course, local businesses that were mentioned before, and also in relation to the exemptions and permits that we were mentioning before. So, and in general, fostering partnership and collaboration, with between transport organizations, but also with public health officials and departments and NGOs. I think in some cases this can actually foster innovation.
I think in response to both questions, but in response to Lisa's question in particular, the license-based or the condition-based access to space, especially curbside space, is really interesting because it makes the use of space conditional on meeting a certain set of requirements that are transparent. And I think that's where I feel like I'm idea speed dating here. That's where Carlos's and NUMO's work around finding the metrics with which you can express that can fit into that side of that kind of dynamic curb management space allocation methodology. I think that's something that we'll probably see more and more in the future, making sure that space is allocated to a use that is seen as having social benefit rather than just personal benefit. And that way it gets away from just allocating space to store vehicles for people who could probably afford to pay for that vehicle being stored in a private space. Carlos, going back either to Lisa's question about how do we take care of people who need to access the city and use their vehicles in the city, or the broader question of how did we end up where we are today in terms of design, process, or accident?
I've shared a lot of links, but I think they're useful for people to look at later, and their Chrome will be exploding by now. When we did this, we used StreetMix with several thousand people because we wanted to define how a street should be designed with feedback from them, from citizens. And when we did that exercise, it was really interesting because people in general were proposing to give more space to public transit, people walking and cycling. And the proposals that they did were increasing the capacity of the streets, in some cases by 60%, and reducing the emissions of the streets in some cases to half. Right. So that was an incredible. I mean, I never expected that it would be so useful in sort of finding exactly what people were thinking. But I think that is a great point. Like, we need to get people to participate in defining things, and that way we can counter sort of the NIMBYism. So for those who don't know, that not in my backyard. When we were doing the participation for the street, for the Septima here, in the example I just shared, many people had two main criticisms. First, that it was a toy, that we were using a toy to get people to participate. And I said, yes, it's fine, it's a toy, it's a game, but it doesn't mean that it's not serious, right? And the second one was that they didn't agree that we should take space away from cars because, and they had a long list of becauses, right? So plumbers, people who need to take a lot of packages and everything. And then I would always say, well, are you doing that? Are you taking a package? No, I'm not. Then don't use the car. Leave the space that we have for the cars for those who are taking the packages. And then they say, no, but you know what? Public transport, they're in a traffic jam. It's a horrible traffic jam because you put a bikeway here. And I said, well, just take the bus and don't take the car so that the space for public transport is better used and not by car. So this is strange rationale in people. I'm just being mindful of time that we have 8 minutes left, so I'm going to.
Karl, I like those examples. Karl, I know that you posted quickly in the discussion that there are psychologistics options. There are the options for people who are using trades vehicles to get into cities. You've seen those put into place. How much of a need is there, for example, for a four-wheeled vehicle versus some of these other lighter vehicles? From the implementation that you've seen through the psychologistics projects that you've managed?
From the psychologistics projects, we found out that there is more than 50%, 51% of all trips that are related to goods transport in urban areas can be easily shifted to bikes, cargo bikes, or bicycle trailers. And this is even a conservative, let's say, assumption. So we have a good chance to get rid of a lot of this delivery traffic. Also, it's the same with the small business who need the plumber and so on, who need some tools for doing their work. This can perfectly done in a lot of cases by cargo bike or bicycle trailer. this is one thing, and that's what I put there with cyclelogistics.eu. There are many examples how to do that and how to set up a business and how to, for startups, whatever, yeah, to do more in this direction. And
well, I know that. Go ahead. Sorry.
The other thing is where does this come from? And I think this is, maybe you all know this article from Jaywalking in the internet, how the car industry influenced more or less the newspapers and so on, and very good. They did a very good lobby work, and that this is good to see. If we want to manage the change, we can use the same instruments as they are well publicized now to do some changes. And in my view, the children could play what Maria José was saying about Barcelona. To work with children is a good way to get the emotional component in this space allocation in the let's say readiness for change, because to have a good situation for the education of children and for their well-being, this is a very emotional thing, and if we put a focus there, like Maria said, if we take all schools or kindergartens and the surroundings and to make them, let's say, car-free or free them from car traffic. So we shouldn't use to close the streets, but to open the streets for all the other uses, but beside the car use. And this is maybe a good starting point to get, maybe not from the engineering side, but more from the emotional side. And I can say this because I'm an engineer. Yeah.
We're running up to the very end of the session. We will not have time to discuss this topic in depth. We're going to do a lightning round based on the poll questions. I'm going to ask each of my panelists the question that I have posted here for the poll. Streets have been quickly repurposed during COVID-19. What is your expectation? What is your expectation, dear panelists, on how long these changes will stay in place after the pandemic recedes, keeping in mind that we're still in it? So a lot of these changes in the allocation of space we've seen, will it be about a third or less, about half, or more than 2/3? And let's make it easy, where you live will remain in place. I'm going to start with Karl. Of the things that have changed in terms of street allocation space is it Graz where you are?
No, we are much behind. So, but we would like to have a situation like in other cities that we had COVID bike lanes, because we have a huge backlog in bicycle infrastructure. But
you had bike lanes already, which some cities didn't have. So that's already good.
We have a very conservative political situation.
All right,
so,
I'm going to switch over. Maria José, you get to choose Madrid or Brussels. Which city do you think will close the city in about a third, about half, or more than 2/3 of those changes will remain after the pandemic?
Well, I am living in Brussels, and I can say I'm positive for several reasons. So on the one hand, because we are seeing this potential for behavior change. So actually, I'm seeing around me many people that have started cycling, for example, as a mode of transport. And once you start, it's easy to carry on. So it's difficult to change them. But now we see many people have got this experience. I'm also positive because of the infrastructure developed and deployed. Some of the numbers, 2,500 kilometers of cycle lanes were announced in Europe, but 1,500 have been implemented. So that's also to be positive. I'm also positive because of the boom of e-bikes and also these forecasts that showed how these numbers will continue to grow exponentially. So these, and also because of the fact that many cities are emerging or have emerged from the pandemic with more with more braver mobility plans, I would say. So with more courage. So for all these reasons, I think I'm aware, of course, there are many threats, but I would be possible. I'm not sure about the concrete number, but I'm positive.
I share your optimism, and I think I should also share the fact that cities have realized they can do a lot more than they thought they could, and that is for sure with Ruth. So will it more stay, or will it more or less? I keep in mind that you are also in the Netherlands, where so much has already been done. So let's talk about maybe you want to talk about more generally how much of these changes.
Actually, it's very instructive because we already have so much. I think there's going to be very little change because we are in a lock-in situation. So I think places that could not imagine a future without, with cyclists or more pedestrians have been able to imagine. That's not the case in the Netherlands. So there's actually very little change. And I would say the change that we had in our cycling city was that people started to walk rather than to cycle. So walking has been booming in the city. And I know many other cities like Paris and in Latin America, walking is, the flaneur is back in the Netherlands. So that is really positive. I also would say what I've observed is that there's a lot of young people who have discovered walking as a social, to be able to talk and to take the streets and I use the street as a beach and a meeting place. And this is the generation that is not, they have fewer driving licenses and fewer cars. So that might be in the long run, maybe bottom up, more support for a different future. But it's very subtle, but not in terms of engineering our policy from the Netherlands. So don't expect anything from us.
It's good to be in a good place. Carlos from Bogota. I know Bogota has done tremendous amount and has actually been very dynamic in your response. How much of it will remain?
The pessimist in me says nothing, but the government says most of it. So I really don't know. I mean, the criticisms that we get all day, every day from everybody, and the stuff that has happened during COVID don't have any foundation, and there is a very strong political push to take out all the temporary bikeways. We may be one of the cities with the largest amount of kilometers of bikeways being deployed. So, I mean, I guess they're pretty angry. We'll have to see when we really open up. We haven't opened up entirely. But I just put my last link, which is an analysis that we did with Tabcoms on actions during COVID-19. And then we found more than 1,000. So that should be good news, right?
It should be. I hope it will be. I know that Bogota has already done a lot, so we'll see what happens going forward. We have been discussing streets that fit us and thinking about how to readdress the allocation of space in our cities, both from a general point of view and in the context of COVID-19. The key takeaways I take are that there is a room for tactical interventions. Democracy matters more than ever in thinking about how to allocate that space. Creativity is essential, giving more room for play, both in our responses, but also as an essential activity in cities. And thinking about what really do we mean by efficiency and efficacy of space allocation, and having the right metrics for that, and thinking about the ways in which we can maximize that so that the most people can have access to the most space for the most uses that they can put it to. So I want to thank Karl Reiter, I want to thank Maria José Rojo, I want to thank Ruth Oldenziel, and I want to thank Carlos Pardo for participating in this conversation with us. I look forward to the rest of the conference and other discussions around this. And thank you as well for the audience for sending the questions and spending this hour and a half together. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good day and a good experience in your city.